for me, once I was received, I was invited to spend a year as a lay assistant in a Catholic parish, what they call a pastoral year, if I were a conventional seminarian. And I spent it in a wonderful parish, St. John's in Severna Park, Maryland, with a priest who has become one of my closest friends in the Baltimore priesthood, Father Jim Prophet. I felt I had a wonderful time there. The people were generous-hearted, generous-spirited. It was a good time for careful renewal in the faith. I loved it. Then I spent a year at St. Mary's Seminary. There were certain areas in which the Archdiocese wanted me to have clearly Catholic instruction, canon law for practical reasons, but also moral theology. There were some significant differences even between traditional Anglican moral theology and the teaching of the Catholic Church, or the way in which the Catholic Church approached that teaching. Someone, Wag, once said that Anglicans and Catholics shared the same principles of moral theology, but always drew different conclusions. And that, again, was a good year. It was kind of challenging at age 62 to go back to being on the receiving end of education.
But probably a joy.
It was great. It was a great joy. And I had some outstanding teachers. Really had the privilege of becoming close with people whose class I joined as they were preparing to graduate, and who really welcomed me, and who, the seminarians you're with are a real part of your formation. So I'm grateful for that year. During that year, I was ordained deacon, and then at the end of that year, on June 24th, 2011, I was ordained a Catholic priest.
Couple issues then, Father. When these wonderful sisters and you, who are their chaplain, come into the church, you've been together, practicing Anglicans for a long time, and then you come into the church and there are a number of theological issues that are a little more fine-tuned than they were. And I tried to imagine how the transition was made. One was the issue of confession. Mm-hmm. Was there confession before?
There was definitely confession before.
So that was a tradition that, as your aspect of Anglicanism, you'd always preserved.
The Anglican prayer book, 1662 and its predecessors, all make provision for a confession to God in the presence of a priest and priestly absolution. And that was very much part of the Anglo-Catholic revival in the 19th century, thus part of the tradition for the sisters.
Okay, so that was a fairly easy transition. The issue of what it means to be saved, because as you mentioned, that between Anglicans there's a wide berth, almost as wide as Protestantism itself.
Yes.
Really? Well, now, how would you explain your understanding of what it means to be saved as a Catholic?
Well, in a way, again, I come out of a particular tradition among Anglicans, and that particular tradition says that salvation is God's work and God's gift to us, and also says that it's through the sacrament, the washing of rebirth, as the optional second reading yesterday put it, that God applies this salvation to the human soul. It's not the idea that baptism is a kind of institution which is a public witness to one's personal conversion and one's personal faith. Salvation is God reaching down and grabbing you and claiming you as his own. Through the sacrament of baptism, through the completion of that sacrament in confirmation.
It really is an amazing parallel between how we're changed and connected to eternity through baptism and how we're changed and connected to eternity through marriage.
Yes.
I mean, the parallels of that, you may not feel that that marriage ceremony did anything 20 or 30 years ago, but you've become one in a very spiritual, real way, that sacramental union that's there. You can't just break. Same thing true with our new creation as a result of baptism.
You are a child of God. You may decide to be the most rebellious child of God you think God has ever seen. You're probably kidding yourself. But you're still his child. He's claimed you. He's marked you. In baptism, in the Catholic Church, and among high church Anglicans also, you're marked with the sacred chrism, with the sign of the cross. That's the spiritual equivalent of branding a slave to show who owns that slave. St. Paul calls himself the doulos, the slave or servant of Christ, and that's our mark as slaves or servants of Jesus.
Another theological issue is the Eucharist. A good friend of, I think, both of ours, Father Dwight Longnecker, wrote a wonderful article. He was a former Anglican and now Catholic priest, but wrote an article on the real presence, recognizing you got to be careful, because just because the Anglicans say they believe in the real presence doesn't mean they believe in the real presence. Right. So they're from a wide breadth of understanding to you and sisters understanding the Catholic perspective.
And the Anglo-Catholic tradition, actually the founders of the Anglo-Catholic tradition suffered because they taught the reality of the real presence. The Anglicans do not teach transubstantiation, that is, an understanding of the means by which Jesus is truly present under the forms of bread and wine. But they do teach a doctrine of the real presence, which is that he really is present under the forms of bread and wine. It's distinct from, for instance, the Lutheran teaching, which says he is present for a purpose, and then, in a sense, it reverts to bread and wine. No, the bread becomes the body of Christ, and that's what it is. The wine becomes the blood of Christ, and that's what it is. We don't understand the mechanism. He didn't tell us, but he did say, this is my body, this is my blood. So, both in the parish I served in Atlanta and again at the convent, the Blessed Sacrament was reserved, was honored with a genuflection whenever we entered or left the chapel. We had adoration, we had benediction and adoration every Sunday, surrounding following the celebration of Vespers. They now have a longer period of adoration, and the Vespers is said with the Blessed Sacrament exposed. So I get confused between then and now. There was a very rich Eucharistic piety in that community. It tends to be reserved in its expression. That's partly the English heritage. But it was very deep and still is very deep.
You had mentioned that this kind of maybe apocryphal way of looking at the difference between Catholics and Episcopals' way of looking at moral issues. You have the same principle but different conclusions. But what about then moving into the Catholic perspective? Because most of us realize it was that Lambeth Conference in the 1930s that opened the can of worms for all the stuff that we're seeing today. That was on the plate of the Episcopalians and the Anglicans. Yeah. How about that for you and the sisters, recognizing the Catholic views of contraception?
Well, it has become obvious it became obvious to the sisters and myself, and I think has become more widely obvious to persons who hold to the tradition, that basically the acceptance of contraception, while not necessarily having a linear connection, has had an actual or historical connection with the loosening of sexual mores and with the ultimate insult to life, abortion. Sometimes a thing that in itself does not seem objectionable, and to be fair, if you look at the minutes of the 1930 Weymouth Conference, they were talking about hard cases, not about generic approval of contraception. But sometimes, even when you talk about and make an exception for a hard case, it comes back and bites you in ways you didn't expect.
Yeah, because